Okay, so we're just about all here, so I figure we may as well get started. It's been a little warm in this building, so I'm going to leave the door open. First, just to quickly explain to you here, in case you are concerned in any way about it, what's going on with the camera. I'm filming my lectures this semester in part for my own benefit, so that I can go back and look them over and see what I'm doing in the classroom and see what's working and what isn't, and sort of review my own teaching, and also partly as a sort of benefit. There is a benefit to you here as well, in that I'm going to be posting these in a YouTube channel. You can then, if you say weren't able to come to class on a particular day, you can always go. I won't get those emails like, Dr. Moyer, did I miss anything important? It's like, no, we sat on our hands and twiddled our thumbs all day. You can just go to the YouTube channel and you can see what we did in class. If you need to review for an exam or something, or you're trying to review for one of the papers, say, okay, I've got this thing in my notes, I don't have any context for it, what did we do that day? You can always then sort of go back and find it. So I'm only filming myself, I'm not filming any of you. If any of you are uncomfortable with the idea of having your voices on the recording, then do please come and talk to me, and we'll see what we can work out. But yeah, you're not going to appear on camera, if that's anything that you're concerned about. Okay, just a quick rundown of who we are, why we're here, what we're doing. Everybody is here for world literature, right? Everybody knows what they're doing here and is in the right place? Yes? Okay, good. Sometimes first day people get a little mixed up. All right, so my name is Dr. Moyer, for those of you who don't know me. My office is across the hall, broom closet 239, and I am in said broom closet on Mondays and Wednesdays from 10 to 12, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 12 to 1. Those are only the times that I have to be in the office. They're not the only times that I can be in the office. So if you need to see me at some other time, just send me an email and make an appointment, right? Don't just show up and expect that I'll be there, right? So if you show up at 4 p.m. on a Thursday and you haven't made an appointment, right, I'm probably not going to be in the office. So just make sure that you contact me beforehand, let me know when you want to come, and we'll see what we can work out. This is the best way to contact me, right? michael.moyer@gsw.edu. There's a phone number on the syllabus, but I'm only in my office 6 hours a week. There's a fax number on the syllabus. The University System in Georgia requires that. Do not try to contact me by a fax, if you even know how to do that. There is also a little email widget in Georgia View. I will say I almost never check the Georgia View email, because I'm not teaching any online classes right now. So if you do email me through Georgia View, I probably won't see it for at least a few days. So if you need to contact me, the best place to do so is here at this email address. Okay, so you know who I am. We all know why we're here, where we are, what we're doing. So why don't I spend a little bit of time now just learning who you are. I already know about a third of you, so this shouldn't take all that long. What I'm hoping you will do, right, I will call out your name. You'll indicate to me, please, who you are and where you are, and tell me where you're from. If you couldn't tell from my accent, those of you who don't know me, I am not from around here. So perhaps you can help me a bit with my Georgia geography. Taral Kumar here. Hello.
I'm from India.
Okay, India's a big country. What part?
Western. Gujarat.
Okay.
The west part.
Yeah, I know where Gujarat is. Okay, Anna Butler.
Here.
Yes.
I'm from Douglasville.
Douglasville. Where's Douglasville?
It's about 30 minutes from the Alabama line and Atlanta, so it's right there in the middle.
Okay. Great. Hugh Campbell. Is Hugh with us? Yes, hello.
From London.
London. Excellent. Rachel Campbell.
I go by McLean, but I'm from Conyers, Georgia.
Okay.
Like Metro Atlanta.
All right. And yeah, that actually that does raise an issue too. Like if there is something that you prefer to be called other than the name on the roster. As long as it is something like an actual name, just let me know and that is what I will call you. What your mother calls you, not what your frat brothers call you, right? Okay. Kayla Carter. Hello.
Fayetteville, Georgia.
Okay. Great. Aja Cobb.
It's Asia,
Asia.
and I'm from Americas.
You're from Americus. Okay, great. Kimber Collier. Yes.
I'm from Blakely, Georgia. Blakely, Georgia.
Blakely. Kiana Cromarty.
Right here. I'm from Sylvester.
Sylvester. Okay, great. Jordan Dowell.
I'm Sylvester also.
Also from Sylvester. Louise Galen.
From Fort Valley, Georgia.
Fort Valley. Excellent peaches. Dylan Garrett.
Oh, Kathleen, Georgia.
I have never heard of that. Where is it?
You know where Perry is?
I do know where Perry is, yes. You have your national fair and all that, yes.
It's like 5 minutes from there.
Why they call it national, I have no idea. Okay, Kendall Harrod.
Americans.
Americus. I have a Harrod in both classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays now. Yes, your sister's in my Brit Lit class. Victoria Hickam. Yes.
I'm from Cartersville, Georgia.
Where's Cartersville?
It's about 45 minutes north of Atlanta.
Okay. Great. Shantiqua Hunt. Are you here? Are you hiding? Are you invisible? Did I mangle your name so badly that you didn't recognize it? No. Okay. John Mann. Yes.
I'm from Lilburn, Georgia.
Lilburn. William Martin.
I realize that. No,
Okay.
I'm from Ellaville.
You're from Ellaville. Okay. I believe we actually have 2 Zachs from Ellaville here. That's gonna get ugly fast. Daniel Manson.
I'm from Athens, Georgia.
Athens. Okay. That I can identify. Great. Saria Mooring.
Right here.
Yes. Hello.
From McRae, Georgia.
McRae. Where's McRae?
It's like 45 minutes south of Cordele.
Okay. I know where Cordele is. Jillian Ogola. Yes.
From Snellville. Snellville.
Snellville. Andrew Patterson? Yes.
Ellaville, Georgia.
Ellaville. Great. Tobias Pittman.
Griffin, Georgia. Griffin.
Griffin. That's on the way to Atlanta, right?
Right.
Andrew Powers.
I go by Drew.
Drew, okay.
Statesboro, Georgia.
We'll just cross out the AN, and you're from Statesboro. Okay. Great. Zach Price.
No, no.
All right. Yep. Here we go. You two can fight later. Kenesha Roberts. No Kenesha. All right. Madison Rutledge. Yes. Hello.
I'm from Dawsonville, Georgia.
Dawsonville.
Donaldsonville.
Donaldsonville.
Very southwest corner.
Okay. Tabitha Sanders. Yes. Hello.
I'm Kathleen.
Okay. Katerina Spitzer. Hello.
Savannah, Georgia.
Savannah. And I can't read my own handwriting. Tiara Turner. Fitzgerald. Okay. Great. And finally, Jacqueline Williams.
And I live in Americas.
You live in Americus. All right. Great. So, before we get into any of the course material, I do want to just sort of quickly go over the syllabus. If you were registered for this course before Christmas, then you will have already seen this. Probably I did send it out. Maybe you looked at it, maybe you didn't. Anywho, important things to note. The required texts for this course, right? The Norton Anthology of World Literature, shorter 3rd edition. It should be 2 volumes. You can usually buy them as a single set. So you've got volume 2 right here. Who's got okay, Kayla, you've got the whole set. If you could just, yes, show everybody what they look like. You will not need to bring both of them to class, really ever. The red one is for the first half of the semester, the yellow one's for the second half of the semester, right? Red one is early lit, yellow one is more modern. Okay. Aims for this course, expected outcomes, you can read all that shit on your own. Requirements. First, I need you to be here, right? You do need to show up. The course does have an attendance policy. More on that in a moment. Even if I am posting the lectures to YouTube, right, watching a YouTube video is no substitute for actually showing up, right? You do have to come to class. I expect you to come to class having done the reading and prepared to talk about it. Today might be a little bit more lecture heavy than I usually like to get since we're just starting out. But in general, the way I prefer to run this class, like I like to take questions from you and sort of use that to figure out, what you want to talk about in the text, and sort of tailor what I'm saying to what interests you or what confuses you, what you need clarity on. So I prefer this to be more of a two-way street here, more of a conversation. And if you're not doing the reading or showing up for class, then we can't really do that, right? Right. I do expect, yes, a level of participation. Participation is not passive, right? Participation is active. I want you to ask me questions. I want you to ask each other questions. I want you to make comments on things that that other people in the class say, right? I want to hear you talking. I am not so enamored of the sound of my own voice that I want to hear it for the whole 75 minutes. I need assignments completed on time. Now, we're moving sort of to a paperless format in this class, right? So all the course documents are posted online, right? The syllabus is online. I'm not distributing a paper syllabus. All the assignments are going to be uploaded to the Georgia View Dropbox as well. You're not going to give me a physical paper. So they'll all be due on 11:59 p.m. on their particular due dates, right? If I do not get it at 11:59 on the due date, it's late. If your paper is a day late, say your paper was due on Thursday and you give it to me on Friday, that's half a letter grade gone. If it was due on Thursday and you get it to me on Saturday, that's a full letter grade gone, right? So you lose half a letter grade for each calendar day that I don't have the paper. The paper must also be formatted correctly, right? All assignments must be turned in, typed, double-spaced, in 12-point Times New Roman font with MLA citation style. If you do not follow the formatting guidelines, I will give it back to you and ask you to do it again. Right? In large part, this is mostly just to make it easy, make the papers easy for me to read, and easy for me to locate your sources and whatnot. All work you turn in must be your own and must be original to this class, right? So, for one thing, you cannot represent anyone else's work as your own, right? You cannot turn in something that someone else wrote without giving them credit and claim that you wrote it. You also cannot turn in work that you have done for other classes or that you are doing for other classes for this class, right? Everything you do has to be your own work, has to be original to this course. A little bit more on, actually, let's just finish with the academic honesty speech right now. The penalty for plagiarism in this course is automatic failure of the course. No second chances, no pleas for mercy or forgiveness, nothing, right? You get caught plagiarizing a paper, that's it. You failed the course. I send a little paper off to the student conduct office. We're done. Now, the attendance policy. And I realize that I guess the lens is dirty or something, because this is really pretty unclear. Yay. Okay. The attendance policy for the course. You get 3 absences. So those are like 3 personal days or sick days that you can take off in case of an emergency, right? Bringing me a doctor's note or a note from home will not get you more absences, right? You get 3, so use them wisely, use them sparingly. Use them if you actually cannot physically come to class for some particular reason, an illness, a family emergency, something of that nature, right? You're not going to get more than 3. For each absence beyond the 3, you lose 2 points from your final average. Now, in the case of a prolonged illness or a family emergency that lasts for some time, contact me, we'll discuss what's going on, and we'll figure out how to proceed, right? There may be some way to mitigate the penalty. It may be best for you to withdraw from the course at that point. But if it happens, contact me, we'll talk about it. All right, if you have a disability, you don't need to come and talk to me about it. We never have to have sort of the awkward conversation about what sorts of accommodations you might need. If you are entitled to any kind of accommodations, you go and talk to the Disability Services Office. They're in Sanford Hall, I think, on the 3rd floor. They will send me a form. The form will detail what accommodations you need. It won't tell me what your disability is. And I will fill it out, sign it, and send it back to them. And you will get whatever accommodations you require. So if you need to do so and have not yet done so, better to do that sooner rather than later, right? So that I can start helping you right now. Writing Center. Everybody knows where the Writing Center is, yes? ACE 104, next building over. Many of you have used the Writing Center before, yes? Yes, okay. So I do give extra credit to students who take their papers to the Writing Center. You take an assignment to the Writing Center. They send me back the happy little email that says, you know, Luis came to the Writing Center and we talked about blah, blah, blah. And you get half a letter grade bonus. So it is well worth your time to go and do this. Finally, in terms of course policies, last thing I want to discuss, cell phones and other such devices. We don't need them for this course, right? We're only here 75 minutes twice a week. For that time, you can disconnect from whatever your mother, father, best friend, significant other is doing, right? So they should be turned off and put away. Yes. If I see it out the first time, I will publicly shame you into putting it away. Second time, I will take it from you and give it back to you at the end of class. Third time, I will ask you to leave and mark you absent for that day, right? So just keep it out of sight. Don't fiddle with it during class. All right, any questions about classroom policies or expectations? Anything that was unclear here?
Are we still doing the thing where, I actually can't remember if it's in class or not, where we have to write? We come in, we do like 10 minutes of writing?
Yes, we are still doing that, and I'll explain in a minute.
Okay.
In fact, we're actually coming to assignments right now. So there are two primary paper assignments, right? You're going to do one roughly 4 or 5 page close reading of a single text. That'll be the midterm paper. And you will do at the end of the semester a roughly 8-page research paper in which you compare one text from the first half of the semester and one text from the second half. Both of the paper assignments are already posted to Georgia View, so you can peruse them at your leisure. But I will go over them in a little bit more detail as we proceed. Right? So just know that those are there and those are coming. There will also be a midterm exam. There will be a short essay section. Right? I'll give you sample questions beforehand to help you study. And there will also be a definition section. But again, more on that when it gets closer to the actual exam date. I don't do a final exam in this course anymore. What I do now instead is a group presentation. Essentially, I will give you a list of texts that you can present on, and you will sort of rank them in order of preference, and then I'll assign groups based on people's preferences, right? I usually try to give everybody their first or second choices. We'll do that after midterm. I don't like to be too negative on the first day, but the reason I don't assign the groups at the beginning of the term is because it's entirely possible that by midterm, some of you might not be sitting here, right? Some of you may have withdrawn from the class. Some of you may have already failed the class for various reasons. It happens. And I don't want any group to get stuck with a group member who isn't going to be able to see the project through. So we'll deal with that after midterm. Right? Participation is worth 10% of your grade. And yes, what Zach was referring to, I do have you do in-class writings. You'll do 10 of these over the course of the term. And each is worth a single point, so it adds up to 10 points total. And here's how those are going to work. All right, from current slide, there we go. Okay, what you're going to do is select a single passage from your reading for that day. No more than a short paragraph, no less than a single sentence, and you're going to copy at the top of the page along with the page number. Right? I do want you to copy out the whole passage that you are going to be working with. One, this encourages you to focus on smaller amounts of text. Right? I don't want you trying to talk about really, really big chunks of text. And if you have to copy out a big chunk of text, right, that's a pain in the ass, right? You don't want to do that. So try to keep your focus small. Also, there is actually some research on the connection between muscle memory and brain function. And actually writing out words will often help sort of reveal insights about language to you that just reading them or skimming them will not. So this is why I want you to write out the full passage. Right? And give me the page number so that I can find it. You're going to look at that passage both in its immediate context, right? Whatever is going on in the text at that moment, right? What is happening in this passage? What does it have to do with this particular part of the text? And try to relate it to some bigger theme, some larger idea that you think is important to the text. Now, you won't get a sort of conventional letter or number grade on this, right? It's checks, check pluses, check minuses. Here's roughly how they translate. So a check plus means that you had a really, really good idea about this text. This might be something that you should, sit on and perhaps develop into a longer, more developed paper. So, good for you. This is some real original thinking. That's the equivalent of an A. You get a full point for a check plus. A check, all right, you've done enough to demonstrate to me that you actually read the damn thing. So you get the equivalent of a C for that. So it's about 3/4 of the point, 0.75. Now, if it is clear to me that you either didn't read the text and are trying to bullshit me, or that you just clearly have no idea what you're talking about here, you end up with a check minus, right? And check minus is worth 0 points. So, bottom line here, right? Do not try to bullshit me, right? It is often best if you already have a passage picked out to write about when you come to class. Right? Something you've already done a little bit of thinking about. I've also given you, on Georgia View, a bunch of supplemental texts, like some articles to read, a couple of videos, some websites that you might find helpful. This is mostly just to give you more context for the works that we're talking about. I would love for you to look at those things as well. One, that means I didn't waste my time posting them, and two, it will actually deepen your understanding of what we're reading. But I don't want you to be selecting your passages from those, right? The passages you select should always be from the literary texts for that day, right? So whatever you're getting from the anthology, that's what you should be choosing your passages from. You can use the supplements that I give you, to illustrate points, though. You can certainly use them in your in-class writings. Just don't make them the main focus. Okay, any questions so far? Now, I know that about a third of you who've already been in class with me have done this and more or less know how the drill works. For those of you who haven't, just a couple of pointers here. One, when you go see a movie with your friends, or you and your friend read the same book and you talk about it together, what's usually the first question you ask each other?
Is it good?
Yeah, is it good? Did you like it? right? Is it good or bad? There's nothing wrong with having tastes, right? There's nothing wrong with having preferences. We all have preferences, right? Some people prefer to watch football. I prefer to watch hockey, right? Okay, fine. I'm from the Northeast. But I'm not really interested in your preferences as far as these texts are concerned. Right? I liked it or I didn't like it is not really an analytical response, and is often a way to shut down having an analytical response to something. If you find that you are overflowing with positive emotion regarding a particular text, unlikely, but it might happen, right? Or you find that you really, really loathe something that you read, try to find some detail in the text that for you really kind of encapsulates that feeling, right? What little detail in the text maybe is causing that feeling, and use that as the basis for a broader analysis. Right? That way you can turn that judgment into a real idea. It is also best, as I said, if you focus on a limited portion of the text, right? Do not try to talk about the whole text, especially since some of the things that we're going to be reading are going to be relatively long. If you try to write about an entire text, what am I going to end up with?
Summary.
Yeah. You're probably just going to run down, point by point, what happened in, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Aeneid or whatever, right? And that's nice, but I don't really need to know what happened, right? I read it too. I know the order of events. That's fine. So when you focus on a limited detail in the text, or just pick some kind of important detail, something small that seems like it might be meaningful, and try to think about what that's doing in the text or what it represents in the text. That said, right, context is important. So always try to make sure that you can connect this detail to some bigger idea, right, to some larger thing that is happening in the whole text. And one of the ways we go about this, right, you look for patterns. You look for particular images that repeat, or particular actions that repeat, particular words or phrases that seem to pop up over and over again, especially if they seem to be kind of weird, given the plot of the text you're looking at, right? Or given, sort of the regular context that you're looking at. For example, when you read Gilgamesh for next time, you're going to see a lot of people taking baths in what is ostensibly an adventure story, right? So think about what those baths are doing there, right? Why is it that these mighty heroes are constantly stopping to take baths, right? What do they do before the bath? What do they do after the bath? Right? These are the kinds of details, these are the kinds of patterns that you should be looking for, trying to pick up on. Finally, I cannot read your minds and do not have direct access to your thoughts. As such, something that may seem clear and obvious to you may not be clear and obvious to me, right? So you might think, well, it's obvious that the baths are a sort of ritual of purification. It's okay, well, explain to me why that's obvious, right? You have to make the connection between the evidence you're using and the claim that you're making, right? A good way to think about this, there's a tool that rhetoricians use. It's called the Toulmin model of argumentation. And I'm just going to give you a very, very simplified form of it, right? We're going to look at this as sort of a three-part thing, right? Every argument has three basic parts, right? A claim, data that you use to back up that claim, and we'll talk about the third part in a minute. Right, so my claim. right? Something that is not immediately obvious, that require evidence to prove, right? I am a US citizen. What's the data I use to back this up? I was born in Pennsylvania. What is my justification for making this claim based on this data? I'm sorry, like you gotta, I don't hear very well, you gotta speak up.
A birth certificate.
Okay, well, that would be the physical proof, right?
Justification is the law states you're born on American soil, you're an American citizen.
Exactly, yeah. So we call that justification a warrant, right? My justification for extrapolating this claim from this data is that anyone born in the US is a US citizen. Okay, so we see how this works, right? You always need to provide for me that connective tissue, right? That logical connection between the claim you're making and the data you're using. Okay, any questions about the in-class writings or about anything that we've talked about so far? I will take your silence to mean no. Okay. Then let's continue. All right, so let's talk about world literature and what it is we're actually doing in this class. Okay, so this gentleman here, this dapper early 19th century German, is one Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. We will be reading his play Faust later in the term. But in the year 1827, Goethe coined the term Weltliteratur, which is German for, can you guess? For literature, yes. Yes, not that difficult, right? Now, what Goethe was arguing for was a kind of cosmopolitan literature that ignored national borders or national traditions, right? That literature, that arts were sort of properties of all people in all nations, at least as long as those people in those nations happened to be in Europe. He wasn't really thinking globally. He was only thinking in terms of his own continent, right? Mostly Western and Central Europe, in fact. You know, wasn't really concerned about all those Slavs either. So Goethe's idea of world literature was sort of like, does anybody know what was going on in the early 19th century throughout Europe historically? Anything that maybe caused people to be very, very nervous about the stability of their lives?
War and bloodshed.
Yeah, lots of war and bloodshed, right? 1827 would have been, I believe, after the Napoleonic Wars. But yeah, Napoleon had by this time largely sort of cut a bloody swath through much of Europe. And French nationalism, other forms of ascendant nationalism were making particularly a lot of educated aristocrats and the artists that they patronized really, really nervous, right? The idea of elevating one nation over others, right? That, you know, one nation has a right to rule others, or that, you know, one nation's culture is superior to another's. Goethe and others like him saw as essentially a road to more bloodshed. So the idea of sort of thinking of art and literature as a shared cultural heritage was supposed to provide a kind of glue that would tie the nations of Europe together, right? So what would Goethe thought of as world literature? Well, his own writings for one thing, right? The ancient Greek and Roman classics, the plays of Shakespeare, the plays of Molière, right? The writings of some of the 18th century French novelists and philosophers like Voltaire. Right? He would have considered all of this part of a common cultural heritage. Now, cosmopolitanism is essentially another word for a kind of internationalism, right, that ignores nationality. Right? We often oppose the term cosmopolitanism to the term nationalism, right? A cosmopolitan writer at least believes that he is writing for all people in all places. A nationalist writer is speaking primarily to people of his own, his own country, of his own race, of his own culture. Now, most writers do not fit comfortably at either extreme. Typically, they'll sort of nestle somewhere in between, right? For example, how many of you have had to read, say, in high school? I know that this is part of a lot of high school curricula. Things Fall Apart by the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe.
I read that.
Okay, you've read it. Okay, so that's one person.
One of those.
Oh, yeah, right, we did it in post-colonial lit, yeah. Nobody else? Okay. Nonetheless, so Achebe is Nigerian. He's a member of a tribe known as the Igbo. And he wrote a novel in the late 50s called Things Fall Apart. And it's about sort of the few years before and after the Igbo people first met English colonists. And it's told from the Igbo perspective. And the first part of the novel in particular is really really immerses you into Igbo culture. It uses Igbo words for things. It discusses everything in terms of Igbo values, but at the same time, it also provides explanations for just about everything that the Igbo characters in the novel do. So on the one hand, Achebe is writing about his own people and his own culture, at least as they were several years ago, but he's explaining all of their actions and all of their beliefs. So is he writing for an Igbo audience? No, yeah, he's writing for outsiders looking in, right? So a novel like that would sort of sit kind of in between the spectrum, between cosmopolitanism and nationalism. Right? He's describing the culture and practices of a particular people in a particular time and place, but he's doing so with an eye towards an international readership. So there is a lot of dispute among readers and among scholars as to what world literature actually means. There are a lot of particularly sort of older, more conservative scholars who largely hew to Goethe's definition of it, that when we talk about world literature, we're primarily talking about the Western canon. One of the big defenders of this idea is a guy who teaches at Yale. His name is Harold Bloom. Bloom is a big defender of the idea of the Western canon. That doesn't suggest, he doesn't suggest that non-Western works don't have value, but he doesn't include them in his canon of great works. Now, many younger scholars in particular prefer the idea of an expanded canon that encompasses works from all over the globe. And this itself is a problematic position as well, because you're often talking about cultures that have no geographic contact with each other, little influence on one another. And in some cases, you end up sort of appropriating particular texts for purposes they weren't intended for. Now, I am more of the expanded canon camp, but sort of with a few caveats. So in this course, we are going to be looking at European literature, but we are also going to be looking at African literature, Indian literature, Middle Eastern literature, and not always with reference to how it relates to European literature or culture. Right? We're going to try to look at each work in its own particular cultural context. Right? The idea is, in part, to try to expose you to a number of different cultural contexts and to try to understand each work as much from the inside as we can. Okay, any questions so far? If anybody has any questions at any point, please do speak up. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. Well, let's talk about what this idea of a canon means in the first place. Does anybody know who these people are? These four folk at the bottom?
Shakespeare.
Okay, yeah. This one's Shakespeare. The guy who's sort of piratical looking.
I can't remember the first one's name, but I know, I recognize him as someone you should know.
You've seen his picture before. Yes, you have seen his picture before. This is Charles Dickens.
Yeah. It's supposed to be Chaucer.
That's Chaucer, yep. And this is Virginia Woolf. So all four of these writers would be regarded as part of a canon of English literature, right? Now, we use this word canon. Does anybody know what I mean? What is a canon?
It's kind of like, in the literary canon, it's used to mean like the major important works that we should all be analyzing.
Yes, exactly. So works essentially that scholars and educated readers consider important. Now, the idea that there is any such thing as a canon is actually relatively new. It's a product largely of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the big proponents of this idea is the poet T.S. Eliot. Right, there's a certain common cultural heritage that all English language writers and readers shared that came through in its influence on later generations, later writers. So if you had to think up a canon, if you had to sort of place writers in a canon of, say, English and American literature, who would you put in there? Who would you choose? Who do you think? What writers do you think are important? And just think back to like classes, like literature classes you had to take in high school, maybe other literature classes you've taken here. Who are the important writers? And don't say Dickens, Chaucer, Shakespeare, or Woolf. Poe? Okay, Edgar Allan Poe. Good. Who else? Homer? Okay, not English or American, but certainly influential.
Aristotle.
Also not English or American, but certainly influential. Right, we're talking about a Greek, right? Okay.
Dante and
All right, let's just think in terms of world then. Okay, so we got Dante. James Joyce, good. Right? Keep going, you're doing great. Writers of global importance.
Mark Twain.
Twain, okay, great. Give me a couple more. Herman Melville. Great.
Hemingway.
Hemingway.
Thoreau.
Thoreau. And give me one or two more.
Orwell.
George Orwell. Excellent. Okay. So, this is quite a group here. What do we notice about all of its members? What do they all have in common?
We're all men.
Okay, yeah, they're all men. What else? Are there any writers of color in this group? They're all men and they're all white, right? So this points to one of the issues that often comes up in the idea of canon formation, right? Essentially, the earliest canons of literature and the ones that have still proven to be influential are not only created by scholars and educated readers, but the scholars and educated readers who came up with these lists tended to be very well educated white men. So they tended to privilege, right, their own reading tastes and the things that they themselves preferred. So they tended to then sort of lionize writers who were more like themselves. Now, the other thing to note about canon formation is that these things sort of shift and change over time. Now, we think of Poe as a big deal, in large part because we all have to read him in high school or in early college courses, right? In his own day, Poe was a laughable failure. And it wasn't until relatively recently, say, the 1970s, that anybody really took Edgar Allan Poe seriously as a writer of important literature. So, writers who were not included in initial canon formation lists can sometimes work their way in. And writers who were once lionized can often find themselves pushed out. For example, Hemingway has kind of fallen out of favor. There aren't a lot of people studying Hemingway these days. So he's falling out of the canon. The same might arguably be said for Mark Twain. So a lot of these writers whom we think of as American or British classics, right, their reputations ebb and flow. So these canons are not static things. And one of the things that scholars have attempted to do over the last 30 years or so is to try to rediscover works by women writers and by writers of color that can be worked into the canon, right? Works that are of quality and that provide perspectives that were largely missing from the canon as it was originally envisioned, right? It's not all old white guys who can read ancient Greek. So writers like Mary Shelley, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, Richard Wright, and you can include contemporary writers who would become more or less canonical, like Salman Rushdie. Or the Turkish writer Orhan Pamuk. right? So these canons are not static, unchanging entities, right? They do break down, and they can be reconstructed. However, the canonical does tend, again, because we're usually talking about the things that are favored by educated readers, it tends towards works that are relatively difficult, right? The tastes of educated readers still tend to be privileged over the tastes of ordinary people, right? So as popular as something like, say, Twilight is, because its readership is mostly made up of preteen and teenage girls, right? These are people who typically aren't given a voice in making up the canon. Okay, any questions about the canon or canon formation? So we're going to be in this class, as I said, taking a sort of expansive view of what makes a literary work important. And we are going to be looking at some things that perhaps from a Western perspective aren't regarded as particularly important, but are particularly meaningful in the cultures that produce them. All right, now, most literature, and we're starting with some of the earliest literature we're aware of, has its basis in myth. What's a myth?
That's the religious text from a religious story from a religion that's fallen out of favor, basically.
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Yeah, it's a story. Yeah, it's a story from a religion that people don't follow anymore. That is one idea. That is one version of what a myth is. Right. There are also myths that have nothing to do with religion, though. Go ahead.
Is it also like turns out to be like not true most of the time? Like it's not real.
That's the way we use the word colloquially, right? That's like in everyday speech. The way we use the word myth is, right, oh, that's just a myth, right? That's something people used to believe, but that they don't really believe anymore. The way we use myth in a scholarly sense actually varies. This is a word that can mean a number of different things. But the thing that tends to unify definitions of myth, right, is it's about trying to explain a reality you can't control. It's a means of getting control of some phenomenon that you don't understand or can't quite encompass with your brain. Whether through ritual or through some other kind of practice, right? Myth is usually connected to some kind of human activity. So these stories, right, and the word myth does come from the Greek word mythos, which means a story or a plot. So we always get a narrative that is connected to some kind of human behavior. So there are three major areas of concern for myth theorists, right? Some myth theorists focus on where myths come from, right? How a particular myth arises. There are others who are concerned primarily with the purpose of myths, right? Why do people come up with myths? Why do people believe in myths? What do they do for the people who make them up or believe in them? And there's a third group of myth theorists who are primarily concerned with what myths are about. Most literary theorists who deal with myth are primarily concerned with this third portion, right? What the myth is actually about. But we're going to be sort of looking at all three aspects as we deal with early literature that has the sort of the strongest connection to or roots in mythology. So this picture here, right, this is a Roman tombstone, and the man depicted on the tombstone is a gallus, plural, Gali. The Gali were a cult in ancient Rome who worshipped a goddess with origins in what is now Turkey, who was called Cybele. Cybele was kind of like this sort of like great cosmic mother goddess. And every year, for a period of a few days, I believe in March, the members of this cult took copious amounts of magic mushrooms and ritually castrated themselves. This does not seem to us to make sense, right? This does not seem to us to be a logical thing to do. So why did the Gali engage in this practice? The practice itself is connected to the central myth of their religion. Cybele has an attendant whose name is Attis. Attis is this sort of divinely born prince with no parents, who, when he is about to be married off to a princess, sees the glorious vision of Cybele in all of her divine radiance, goes insane, and castrates himself. So this practice has to do with this myth, right? This practice is connected to the story in some way. Most myth theorists would agree on that. Where they might disagree is how it's connected. So this dapper Scottish gentleman is one James George Fraser, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough. Now, Fraser was particularly interested in fertility cults, right? Ancient religions that were primarily devoted to the abundance of the crop and the abundance of the people as well, right? Our crop should be abundant and our people should be numerous. Now, one thing he noticed about many of these ancient fertility religions is that a lot of them were centered around a sort of dying god figure. Right? So, for example, the Viking god Balder, the Egyptian god Osiris, the Middle Eastern Adonis, the Aztec god Chipetotec. And he even connects this to the Easter story, to the story of Christ. Although in the first editions of the book, he actually had to cut those chapters out because they were regarded as a little bit too much for people. And his basic premise is, right, that these dying god myths reflect actual ritual practice. That every year, the worshippers in these cults would choose a particular representative of the god. And for a year, that man would live like a god, right? He would get whatever he wanted. He'd get the best food. He could have, any luxury items he wanted, any women he wanted. He was entitled to anything. And then at the end of that year, he's ritually killed, and his blood is sprinkled on the fields to ensure the fertility of the crop. And then on the people to ensure the fertility of the people. So Fraser would connect this myth and this practice to these fertility cults, right? he regarded myth as a sort of primitive version of applied science, right? Applied science, right, is you're using theories that you draw from science for some kind of practical purpose, right? So what Fraser suggests these people believe in myths, and they believe in the rituals that are attached to the myths because they hope to get something out of it, right? They expect that if we do this particular thing the same way every year, we will benefit from it in some way. So a theorist following Fraser would argue that the Galli sacrificed their own fertility in order to encourage the fertility of the crops or the rest of the people, right? That there is a practical purpose in mind for doing so. Now, this gentleman, with the rather precious little pipe sticking out of his mouth, is the Belgian anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. And Lévi-Strauss thinks of myth, or thought of myth, he's recently deceased, a little differently from Fraser. One thing that he noticed is that myths seem to be by and large arbitrary, right? They often don't make a lot of narrative sense. Anything can happen to anyone at any time. And yet at the same time, myths across cultures tend to be very, very similar to one another, which points to sort of the similar roots of all human cultures. This is a position that anthropologists call essentialism. Right? The idea that all human cultures are more similar than they are different. And that what anthropologists should be looking at is these similarities that bridge cultures. And yet, the concept for which Lévi-Strauss is most famous is the idea of myth as a kind of resolution of opposites by some kind of mediating force, right? So he talks a lot about what he calls binary oppositions. And he argues that myths are often about reconciling these opposed pairs, right? So take a minute and try to think about some cosmically significant opposed pairs. Or things that might be opposed pairs that might be in some way mythologically or ritually significant. Significant to human life in some way. If you have any sort of familiarity with myth, think about what sorts of forces tend to be opposed to each other. Well, let's think think about sort of if we think about human beings and the way biology divides us up, right? 52% of us are, and 48% of us are. Pardon?
Male and female.
Yeah. Roughly 52% of human beings are women, roughly 48% are men. It might be a little bit off on the ratio, but it's, yeah, so, right, this is one of these sort of key oppositions, right? Male and female, light and dark, right? Sky versus earth, right? A lot of myths are concerned, in Lévi-Strauss's view, with bridging the gaps between these opposed pairs. So Lévi-Strauss would see a ritual like that performed by the Galli, and he would argue that what the Galli are attempting to do is reconcile gender difference, right? That what they're trying to do is essentially eliminate gender difference by eliminating what makes them men. Now, this is the Romanian philosopher of religion, Mircea Eliade. And for Eliade, a myth is always an origin story. All myths explain how some practice or some place or some natural phenomenon came into being. So, Eliade would argue that this practice is directly based on the actions in the story, right? That the story comes first, and the mythic practice, the ritual practice, then grows out of it, right? Essentially, that these priests perform their ritual in imitation of an origin story. Now, on the opposite side of that is the also recently deceased literary critic and anthropologist René Girard. I am really fond of photographs of elderly French philosophers pointing bony fingers at people. So this is probably not the last you'll see of this sort of thing. But Girard essentially turns Eliade's theory on its head. Right? What Girard says is that actually these priests were probably already doing something like this before the myth was invented. And that myth is in fact a justification for an existing social ritual that's created after the fact. Right? People may have already been doing this for centuries, and they either didn't know why or had forgotten why, and they made up the myth of Attis to explain something they were already doing. So most of these theories have focused on the origin and function of myth. When we get into talking about Gilgamesh next time, we will also discuss some theories that are concerned primarily with the subject matter of myth. But I do want to show you first some of the resources that I posted for you in the Georgia View content browser. So one thing that I do for all of my classes, I do compile a bibliography of the sources that I consult when I'm coming up with a lecture, right? For you to go and look for more information if you want to. So I have bibliographies here for Gilgamesh, the first half and the second half. This is also going to be helpful for you when you start working on your research paper, right? One of the most common panic utterances that I hear from students toward the end of the semester is, I couldn't find any sources. I couldn't find any sources. Well, I'm giving you sources, right? You can use these bibliographies as a starting point when you start working on your research paper. Now, I've also posted here 2 articles in PDF form. The first is on Mesopotamian religion, particularly Mesopotamian afterlife practices, which will be important for the second half of Gilgamesh. And the second is on a concept called liminality, which we'll talk about in more detail next time. Essentially, limen is the Latin word for threshold, and something that is liminal is something that exists sort of in between two states, right? So, like for example, when a child reaches puberty, right? You're no longer a child, but you're also not an adult yet. You're in a sort of liminal in-between state, right? You're kind of both and neither. So this essay focuses on how liminality works in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I've also got a chronology of Mesopotamian history. I've got a recording of a portion of the epic performed in the Sumerian language. And about an hour-long French TV special dubbed into English, so you don't have to try to understand the French, on Mesopotamian history and culture. So this is all stuff that's there to try to help you understand what's going on in what you're going to be reading. So I have some reading questions for you as well, right? You can do what you like with these. These are mostly just to sort of help you generate ideas as you're reading. You can take your phone out and take a picture of this if that's what's easiest. You can copy down what's here if you need to. But usually, when this pops up, this marks the end of that class period. So this means that we're done, that I'm done talking, that you are free to go. And if you did fill out that info sheet that I sent to you before Christmas, please leave it on the front table here. If you did not, that's okay. You can pull it down from the Georgia View content browser and just bring it on Thursday. All right, so we will see you in 2 days.